This podcast is a production of Unfiltered Studios. If you would like to know more about joining Unfiltered Studios, please visit our website at unfpod.com for more information.
In 1968, America was a pressure cooker. Anti-war protests erupted on college campuses, a presidential candidate was assassinated, and the Democratic National Convention in Chicago spiraled into chaos after LBJ dropped out of the race. Fast forward to 2024, and it's deja vu all over again. A president steps aside, a candidate is attacked, and foreign policy protests ripple across the country. As Kevin Boyle, author of The Shattering America in the 1960s, explains, history doesn't repeat itself, but it helps us understand how we got to where we are today. The past is woven into our political DNA, shaping every twist and turn. The same fault lines, race, government control, foreign policy, these things that cut deep in 1968 are still haunting us today. Inflation, war, social unrest, it's all echoing through time, with youth activism once again at the forefront, whether it's fighting for civil rights in the 1960s or climate justice today. The elections of 1968 and 2024 are like mirrors, reflecting deeper fractures in society. For instance, Nixon's Law and Order campaign speaks to the same fears fueling today's push for tougher crime and immigration policies. Both eras have seen the rise of political polarization and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty about our future. And to discuss this all, I'm joined by Smith from the Story of podcast and Mr. Beat from the YouTube channel of the same name. And together we break down these parallels where history loops back and discuss how they shaped us, because that's the only way we might finally break free from its grip. So let's dive into how the seismic events of 1968 still shape America today. But find out for yourself in an episode I'm calling How 1968 Changed America and Why We're Still Feeling It in 2024.
It won't always be a straight line.
It won't always be a straight line.
It won't always be a straight line.
But take the journey.
Take the journey.
Take the journey.
And escape a while for thoughtful excursions
Into the world of ideas across media,
politics, technology,
Pop culture.
and all realms of civic life. Take the journey.
Take the journey.
Take the journey.
Take the journey. Take the journey.
Take the journey.
You're listening to The With Jay Burke Show.
My first guest likely needs no introduction. He's one of the hosts of the Story of podcast, a podcast where each week Joe, Camp, and my guests take you on a journey through fascinating and sometimes strange topics. Of course, I'm talking about Mr. Smith from the Story of. And then my other guest is a YouTuber, video producer, podcast host, and musician from Kansas. His YouTube channels have over 1 million subscribers and 200 million views. So it's fair to say it's growing. It expands his classroom globally, focusing mostly on American history, but he also loves geography, economics, politics, and much more. He is Mr. B. Guys, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hello, Jason. How are you?
I'm good. So we're all together tonight for a very special topic, and it is the year 1968 in America. And for people who aren't huge history buffs, they might be thinking, why 1968? But 1968 is this year of immense change in America. I was really trying to think of one word to sum it up, and I couldn't. I don't know if a word pops into your mind. I thought maybe at the end I'd try to think of something, but I had a million different words. I had upheaval, turmoil, but then I I didn't want to say it was like all bad. So I don't know where to go with that.
You could say, pivotal. You could say
True.
important. I mean, again, there's, whether we take good or bad out of it, if we look at the scope of, just it's the significance of this year, specifically in modern American history, it's a pretty important year, certainly a turning point, I think, in modern American history.
Yeah. In order to try to get this visualized how different it was, I was looking at the elections in 1960 and then the
Mm.
election in 1964. I mean, you could really just even look at 1964. It's Lyndon B. Johnson, the Democrat, versus Barry Goldwater. Obviously, there's, the civil rights issues are there, the Great Society programs, the Cold War is always in the forefront at that time. But Johnson wins that in a landslide. He wins
Mm.
61.1% of the vote and 486 electoral college votes.
My God.
And then 4 years later, he's not even accepting the Democratic nomination.
That's crazy. Like, that's just such,
Yeah.
So,
like, that's a massive turnaround, man.
I mean, that's just a wild turnaround. And it's a guy who passed so much legislation. I mean, so much legislation we still have,
Sure.
so he's obviously responsible for the Great Society programs, which is Medicare and Medicaid, instrumental in student loans,
Sure.
obviously,
You
civil
get the
rights
Voting Rights
acts.
Act, yeah, the
Yep,
Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of '68, right? That opens
right.
it up to housing as well. Like, there's a ton, sure.
But in history, where would you guys even rank him presidentially? Because he was a guy who wanted to be like Mount Rushmore type, and some of those programs, you probably, if he didn't have the issues he had, the Vietnam War, maybe he might be up there.
Defer to Mr. Beat. Mr. Beat, I know you made quite a few videos of rankings of presidents. Where's your view of Johnson? Where do you think he stands?
I think he's probably still in the upper half of
Hmm.
the 46 presidents we've had. So maybe 20, maybe as high as 15, but no higher than 15.
Sure.
And it's always that one thing. It really is just the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
I mean, if you really look at his mishandling of that in particular, because he did have opportunities to just say, you know what, we're not going to do this. But not only that, like, he proactively escalated that conflict, and he practically begged Congress to say, please, let's send ground troops over there to Southeast Asia to fight communism, and it was all in the name of, like, just trying to appease the hysteria that was still lingering from the 50s. The second Red Scare was kind of, people always associate it with McCarthy in the 1950s, but it was kind of still there a little bit in the 60s.
Absolutely. Sure.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, no,
definitely.
I agree. I think that's a proper placement there. I would agree with that. Not that I have anything to, but I'm saying I agree 100%. It's
But
a
yeah,
very good assessment.
all his accomplishments, people tend to forget that there
Yeah.
were so many, with civil rights and with social safety net. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's weird.
Well, I always look at the social safety net, Medicare and Medicaid. Conservatives always wanted to balance the budget or cut the budget. They've never been able to touch that. Very unpopular, even with a lot of older conservatives who vote that way. It just, you can't touch it. So, I mean, that's a lasting legacy of that program. Vietnam is definitely his issue. Um, but that's Vietnam's such a weird war. So, I was trying to look at this, and obviously that's the boomer generation is coming into its own during that time. They grew up on the heels of, I remember listening to some of them talk about their fathers talking about World War II.
Yeah, it was their war, their time to
Yeah,
their
but
time to shine.
I could see why all the protests and all the animosity. It's a war that wasn't it wasn't righteous, like World War II. Obviously, there was terrible things done by everybody, and that happens in war. But at the end of the day, America's, I know we wrote the history books at that point, but we're still on the righteous side of it. When you compare Hitler and what they wanted to do to us, it's such a different war. It just seemed, and maybe it's hindsight, but it seems so unnecessary.
Sure. I think it kind of goes into what you were saying too. Like, I was just talking to my wife about this the other day, and I can't believe she was listening because it was, it's a historical topic, and she just
That's
tunes me out all the time.
Yeah.
But there's a big difference there because there was a legitimate existential threat when it comes to Nazi Germany. They were legitimately going to plan on, attacking the United States. It was a legitimate threat, right? Had they gotten the nukes before us, we would have been nuked. Like that's,
Hmm.
Ho Chi Minh was not going to invade Washington D.C. There was just no chance. You know what I mean? Like that was not a legitimate threat. Now again, you look at Cuba and the second Red Scare as Matt was talking about, right? That was still lingering for sure in the 1960s, especially after Cuba, right? Now you got 90 miles off the coast in our backyard, right? So the whole idea of domino theory and all that stuff, yeah, I mean, like I just say, like there was a legitimate, actual, real threat, and I think going back to the year 1968, you've got very early on, January, right? January 30, 31st, the Tet Offensive. And I think that really, it turns, it changes it where we essentially, we found out really that the American government was lying about our standing in that war. They
Hmm.
were like, he said it himself. He when he loses Cronkite, because Cronkite says right there, right, we're mirrored in a stalemate. And he's like, if I lose Cronkite, I lose the average American, right? And I think that's really when everything flipped,
It
because
was.
because the Tet Offensive is right. I mean, that's it, man. That's the arrow in the heart right there,
Yeah.
and I think that's what the two wars, like you said, Jay, was righteousness, right? I mean, there was just right and wrong. There was Nazis. They had to be stopped, and it was a legitimate threat to the United States. They had U-boats off of all of our shores, right? But Ho Chi Minh was not going to invade the United States. We were not going to be invaded by the North Vietnamese.
Yeah.
And the Soviet Union wasn't going to invade us at that point. I mean, the closest was probably the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Sure.
which 6 years prior, you had. I mean, yeah, it was legit, like to actually fear the Soviet Union because they were up to all kinds of stuff. But so were we. I mean, we now
Sure.
know
Yeah.
that we were probably just as bad, if not worse. When I say we, I mean the American government. The other thing is like even though people were starting to turn against the Vietnam War after the Tet Offensive in January of that year, I would still say the majority of Americans were still like, well, that doesn't mean we stop fighting communism
Oh,
completely. No, we still
absolutely.
need to fight communism. It's just that this is, not the way to do it.
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's because that's going to follow up until the Reagan administration as well, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
goes all the way up to the 80s. I mean, look at Rocky. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah. I think, I
Rocky
think,
Four, baby.
yeah.
Yeah. Like, come on now.
No, I think that's actually a great point. It wasn't the fight against, I almost said terrorism, the fight against communism that was the issue. It was how we were doing it. I think an interesting thing to remember during that time, right? The average American has a television now,
Hmm.
and 1 out of 4 Americans have a color television. And I believe during the Tet Offensive that, can't remember the name, but there was that assassination on TV. Not assassination, but the was it a North Vietnamese soldier who got just killed on TV?
Or Viet
And
Cong, I think.
or Viet Cong. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it was
Super famous. Yeah.
yeah. So I forget the names. I should have had it in this thing, but that really changed a lot of the perspective of the
Sure.
war once people saw that. I mean, because that's where people started to feel like unclean, and that righteousness we're talking about isn't there at all in that
Yeah. I
moment.
mean, they watched the war as they were eating their TV dinners. I mean, essentially every night, they you know, watch the Vietnam War happen in front of their eyes. I mean, that's a crazy thing to think about, right? To have that much,
I did look it up.
blasted in. You got it. All right, what do we got?
You have it. Vosu, the execution of Vosu on February 2nd, 1968. It was the video was broadcast on the Huntley Brinkley Report. And yes, very graphic. But a lot of people saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That
That'll turn some stomachs, man, for sure.
Yeah. And of course, it's funny because Vietnam becomes this impetus later on, especially in the election. It's one of it is like basically the main theme of that election. I mean, there's some other things playing in there, civil rights and even inflation starting to rear its ugly head during that time. But the Vietnam War is the battle at home too. And it's funny when you think about I'm watching some of the stuff just prepping for this, and I'm watching Nixon just talking about, peace with honor. And I'm like, we didn't get out of the war for another 7 years or whatever it was. So, it's unbelievable. But yeah, that's the focus of most of the unrest, as far as even the Democratic Convention that comes up later. The anti-war protesters, a lot of the colleges, and I think this sparks some of there's a lot of changes happening socially too between the Civil Rights Act. It's kind of a 1-2 punch. It kind of realigns all the parties later on.
The war is certainly, it's an anchor piece, right, to everything essentially that's taking place in 1968. It really is this anchor piece background where everything is kind of, growing from this or some way touching it, right? There's nothing that's happening in 68 really that is not some way affected by Vietnam. What's crazy too is like when we talk about somebody specifically like a politician having a downfall, what do we always call it? We call it, it's their what? They're going through their Vietnam.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
Always their Vietnam.
And that's the word, right? That's the terminology, right? The phraseology that we use to describe somebody whose whatever situation is taking him out, because that's what it did to Johnson, right? Exactly. Yeah, as you guys mentioned before, his numbers in 64 were crazy, and then to not even go for re-election, that's nuts.
He should be able to sail through with those numbers. Like it just
should have been, yeah.
But it's actually, that word now is used. It's used to describe quagmires, right? Russia had invaded Afghanistan. That was their Vietnam. They were there 8 years. Yeah. So, obviously the Tet Offensive is the first thing that comes up. There was attacks on 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam. The shooting happens in February. I thought it was interesting. I never really looked too far into this, but I don't. Did you guys look into the Kerner Commission report? Because that's February.
Yeah, the Kerner Commission report is insane. Like that's just, not for nothing, but to me personally, as a civics teacher, as American history teacher, Matt, your American history teacher, this is pieces of this, something should be read, in my opinion, in every history classroom, especially in according to the backdrop of today, right? There's so many parallels and similarities and things that just haven't changed, right? From the Kerner. It's crazy, to see, just how much of it is there.
You want to know what's crazy is since the Kerner Commission, segregation is even worse today than it was in 1968. If you look at makeups of every American city they are more segregated today. The schools are more segregated. It's kind of mind-blowing when you really, it's like, it's something that just people stop talking about, or the people that do talk about it now, we call it systemic racism, but there's actually a pretty huge backlash against that. And it's like, how do you not understand that the momentum of history?
Matt, stop being woke.
There was no progress. You're
being woke, Matt.
That's right. I woke up.
Yeah. I have to be honest, I've heard of it. I never really looked that deep into it until I knew we were doing this show together. But it blew my mind to really look into it and see the parallels. That's where we get the saying, the conclusion was that our nation. Well, let me give the backdrop of
Yeah, I was
it.
gonna say,
Yeah.
explain why
Do
they
you
did
want
it
to give?
begin
Do you
with.
want to give the backdrop, Mr. B? You probably do a better job.
Well, I only know basic information about it as well, but yeah, like it was just a response by the Johnson administration to investigate like what the heck happened last summer, because in the summer of 1967 there were all these race riots all across the country, and then of course in 1968, pretty similar situation except even more amplified, because now you have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Added to it. But yeah, like it was, I think, centered on Detroit. There was these riots there that those are the ones I'm most familiar with because
Yeah, that's the
I
big
think
one. Newark
yeah.
had a pretty big one too. Newark, New Jersey.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I think 47 people died. I want to say 100 died in Detroit, but I don't have it in front of me. But yeah, that's the big one that they talked about was the Detroit riot.
Mm-hmm.
When I read about this, they were talking about how Johnson is like, why is this happening to me? You know what I mean? Like, because in his head, he's like, I've done so much for the Black community. We passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which it does a lot of things, but basically it ends segregation in a lot of ways, segregation in restaurants and hotels and stuff like that. It makes it illegal. But the race riots happen, so he establishes that commission, and what they said at the end of it was that we are moving towards two different societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of recommendations for reducing the racial disparities, but the contributing factors are basically a lot of the same issues that we're talking about today. Bad policing practices and a flawed justice system,
Sure.
exploitative consumer credit practices, poor and inadequate housing conditions, high unemployment rates among African Americans, voter suppression, and lack of proper training for police officers and National Guard troops, which often escalated the violence.
Dude, the language that they used in the Kerner Commission is insane. Essentially, like you said, like they wanted to figure out what happened in 67, what was behind it, and how can we keep this from happening again? And you're absolutely right. That's like the famous quote is moving towards two societies. But they also basically stated that all of this was a result of white supremacy. That's it. Like it was a result of white supremacy. Like they literally use those words. And they come out and they say that specifically they're talking about a lot of it is urbanization. And they use the term ghettos, and they said ghettos essentially were created by the white people, maintained by the white people, and essentially celebrated by the white people, right? And if we do not do something about this, the the urbanized areas within places, the inner cities are going to become all people of color if we don't stop. And then one of the main things that they said, we had to change our views, but change our mentality. I mean, that's really what it was. We could have policy change and all that stuff, but nothing is going to change unless Americans, specifically white Americans, change their thought process and change the way that they view other Americans and other human beings. And we weren't able to do it, and it's such crazy, report to come out, and not many people are very aware of it. Look, I'm not an expert on it either, but it's just such a crazy report from, the United States government to come out and say, yeah, we got a lot of racial problems and it's all because of white supremacy. Like, we should do something about this.
It reminded me a little bit of the report on marijuana that came out, and they were like, no, we don't like this.
Yeah.
Remember?
Yeah, the same thing. They said, hey, marijuana actually, there's no evidence that it's damaging to society. Some of these other drugs we might explore, but no, there's no reason to make it illegal. And then, the Nixon administration just turns around and is like, nah, we're gonna ignore that because we want to make it illegal anyway.
This is public enemy number one. Yeah, Class A.
Class A.
What's
the worst label we can give it? Give it that one.
No
Schedule
medicinal,
1. Yeah.
Yeah. No
schedule.
No medical uses for it, stuff like that.
Oh my gosh.
Right? I mean,
yeah.
We want it up higher than heroin.
Yeah. When I read that,
Insane.
that's what I thought about. I mean, obviously, it's a different level, but one of the things they talked about too, this was the problem again, Vietnam's in the backdrop. Um, they said about investing in these communities and
Yep.
investing in infrastructure, investing in education, better education for Black youth, and just to create more opportunity. And Johnson's churning through money with the Great Society programs. He's churning through money in Vietnam. The last thing he wanted to hear was that. It totally contradicted
Sure.
everything.
Yeah.
Congress didn't want to hear it either. Inflation isn't bad yet, but it's starting to hit.
Yeah. Oh, that's an important thing to bring up. 1968 is the first time in decades where inflation starts to creep back up.
Mhm.
That's another reason why I think Johnson's popularity went down, even though presidents don't have much control over the economy or inflation, stuff like that. But they always get blamed for inflation.
Yeah,
Yep.
no, that is that I read that too. I think it usually went up 1 to 2%. 2% would be a lot at that time for about 20 or 30 years or whatever it was. And now
Yeah,
it's getting like 4 or 5%. So it wasn't, I mean, it
exactly.
wasn't at the level by the
70s.
70s,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Jeez.
and then you get the whammy the double whammy with the
Yeah,
oil shocks
stagflation.
and
Yeah.
stagflation.
Stagflation for sure. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, but yeah, he couldn't. He was like, "That's the last thing I want to hear." So there was reluctance to do that. But I did read that this also bothered Johnson because now it was alienating white middle class, especially northern white voters who had been along for the ride on civil rights, said they were fine with that, but this was too aggressive. Like we don't want to tackle this.
Again, because of TV. I mean, TV having so much influence. I mean, think about it. Like a big reason why civil rights legislation happened was because public outcry because of what they were seeing in places
Yeah.
like Selma, where these police officers were just brutally beating innocent African Americans that were just, protesting. And Martin Luther King Jr., of course, and Malcolm X and other activists, Fred Hampton, they all knew
Mhm.
that, hey, get those cameras on us because then people
Brilliance.
they'll have empathy. The same
Yep.
thing with the Vietnam War. It's like they're seeing these innocent Vietnamese get caught up in this unnecessary war. Oh, especially younger people. They were like the baby boomers that were now reaching adult age for the first time in the 60s. They're like, what the heck? You raised me to love thy neighbor, and aren't they also our neighbors? And so that empathy was there. But then with the riots in 1967, like, oh, no, 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 no. I'm not going to have empathy for those people that are,
Mhm.
damaging public or damaging private property. Why would I? We passed the Civil Rights Act. They should be fine now.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah,
on TV, they saw the riots.
you're right. That's actually a huge portion of when I was reading too. Yeah, watching the riots turned a lot of the people who had sympathized for them off. But that's a great point. I
Yeah.
mean, TV plays such a role in that whole era. I mean, even you go back to 1960, you have the first televised debate between Kennedy and Nixon, and people who listened to it on the radio were more apt
Right.
to think Nixon won it.
Nixon won. Yeah.
But when you went and watched it on TV, and uh, you see Nixon, and he's kind of disheveled.
Sweating all over the place.
Yeah, and John F. Kennedy's just got a great suit on, great head of hair.
It was such a boss move by Kennedy though with the
Makeup.
makeup.
Yeah.
It was
Did the
such a
makeup.
good.
By the way,
No, I'm not wearing makeup.
Nixon did win those debates, by the way, I should say.
But
Yeah.
like going back to it though, like it's such a strange. I don't want to say strange. Again, it's just like if you look at the hope from the early '60s, right? You've got Kennedy in there. You've got going to the moon, right? In this decade, because we'll do the other things and do those things and the others, right? Because they're hard, not because they're easy. All that kind of stuff. You look at the hope, right? The message of hope in the early '60s, and then just this garbage, this dumpster fire of 1968. right? It's just crazy on just how much everything unravels in a matter of 8 years, right? I mean, it's just like it's just such a strange, juxtaposition between those two time periods. I've always, if you grew up through the 90s, right? Like we did. It's so like you could always I always think you could break up decades into two half decades because 1990 to 95 is a completely
Different.
different decade
Yeah.
from 96 to like 2000. You know what I mean? And I think it's the same thing. You could do it with every decade, but really especially with the 60s. The early 60s and the late 60s are just such different time periods. They're such different, ends of a spectrum of a decade. um it's just so crazy,
Yeah.
and to go, I know, let me just go back real quick. Let me just piggyback on a point that Mr. Beat made earlier about segregation being worse today. I teach about that in my civics class, and so I was looking, around. I was looking for information, and the New York Times did an expose about, I don't know, about 8 or 9 years ago, and they found that the most segregated place in the United States today. Do you guys know what it is? This is now as of 8 years ago, but I don't think much has probably changed. And take a wild guess. Anybody know?
Omaha, Nebraska. I don't know.
Good guess. Good guess.
I used to live
Jay?
there, so I knew how segregated it was.
It's
Remember, it might be a little biased because it's the New
Arkansas.
York
I'm
Times.
just throwing it out there. Arkansas. I don't know.
Long Island, New York.
No.
Oh, wow.
Long Island, New
That's
York.
surprising.
And it sounds, but I like growing up there, and now I'm in North Carolina. I'm down here 10 years. Now hearing that, and then like now oh my God, they're right. Like it's crazy to think about it, how segregated Long Island is. It is insanely segregated. There are legitimately white towns and Spanish towns and African American towns, or there are towns where there's just literally a white side, and then there are right Spanish parts or African American parts. It's insane how segregated it really, really is. And I never thought about it. It's hard to see it while you're in there, right? It's hard to see the forest for the
Yeah.
trees. And then when you leave and then you read it and you're like, oh my gosh, man, like wow. So yeah, as of about, like I said, about 8 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. Yeah, the New York Times did a crazy expose and looked at Long Island as the most segregated place. Now that's a whole nother episode for Robert Moses, and played a pretty crucial part in that. But yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to piggyback off of that. It was a really interesting article. Not many people would say, right,
I would never.
yeah, especially in the Northeast, part of the United States, right? I think most people would go maybe Midwestern, right? Or
Like Milwaukee or something. Yeah.
yeah, sure,
Well,
or
because
definitely maybe a southern place.
Queens is like the most diverse place I think in the country.
Sure, Queens, but that is a different. It's a different borough.
Not too far away though.
No, it's not. But it's not. It's not the suburbs. It's not the
Yeah.
suburbs that were created by, Robert Moses and Levitt. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
and most of Queens will tell you it's not part of Long Island too.
You
So
want to know?
there's always that argument.
It's weird. So both of my parents were born in Brooklyn, and anybody listening now who's younger than a certain age doesn't know what Brooklyn was before it became a hipster haven and
Yes.
whatever it is now. And it was projects. My parents were
Sure.
both from poor areas, but it was kind of like that. So my dad was Irish. He lived on the Irish, and my mom was Italian. She lived with the Italians. It was kind of weird that they got
Mhm.
together. Like people would look, and you don't think anything of it now. But and then it's the same thing. African Americans here, and then
Sure.
you had maybe Germans here, whatever it was. But it was very separate while they were growing up. Like that wasn't a weird thing. Like certain blocks, they would always think, oh, that's just what's whatever.
Little Italy, yeah, all
Yeah,
that stuff.
yeah, yeah.
But if you even go back and you look at the Kerner Commission report, they talk about that in the Kerner Commission report, right? They talk about the fact that so many of those policies of not giving, the financial support to the African American communities and things of that nature, the approach, right, of what we say today is systemic racism is creating white flight. And that is really, right, the creation of Long Island is white flight from the cities after World War II, where they established this place for upper or middle class and upper middle class folks that they can go live, but still commute and work in New York City, but not have to live in that area. But they create such an area where you have restrictive covenants and things of that nature. Essentially like the 1950s, 40s, 50s, and 60s versions of HOAs, to keep people of color out of neighborhoods, and it was incredibly successful. They did it, I mean, they accomplished their means, to create all white neighborhoods specifically in Long Island. It's crazy. And it's still around today. It's nuts.
The Kerner Commission is a good way to segue probably into Martin Luther King, because
Sure.
that comes up in April. I even want to bring up a little bit of Resurrection City, because that's in June. But,
Yeah.
obviously, while we're on the topic, Martin Luther King is assassinated on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there for the two garbage truck workers who got crushed.
Yes.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yes.
I was just there last year at that site.
Were you really?
Yeah, the hotel's still there. They preserved the cars are still preserved exactly as they were
Really?
in April of 1968. Yeah.
So you're telling me you walk into like that parking lot and it's April 4th, 1968.
Yep, it is.
The
They
whole
preserved
Really?
exactly as it was when he was.
Wow.
Yeah. And then
Right.
the rest of it, the hotel's a museum now, Civil Rights Museum.
I
Pretty
got to
cool.
get there. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's wow,
Right.
that's insane.
Now I kind of want to go there. I always want to go there anyway, as I've never been there. But okay, so yeah, this was spurred on. It was supposed to be a peaceful protest. Honestly, when I look back at it, I mean, the cops weren't going to let it be peaceful. But March 28th, 1968 was when the protest starts. But it was in support of sanitation. Two sanitation workers, well, all the sanitation workers it was for, and they're getting some kind of union rights and stuff. Two guys ended up dying because they were working long hours. They weren't allowed to eat lunch wherever they wanted to, and they ended up doing somewhere. They sat at the back of the truck, but there was a malfunction on it, and they ended up getting crushed in it. I think is how the story goes. Now, for this march, there was 64 injuries. There was 300 arrests. There was one marcher's death. It did turned into a violent protest, and there was obviously damage and stuff like that. But if you're watching the video, and this is another thing when we talk about TV, the cops, the police are so unaware. I don't know. They're not like aware of the camera being there. They just like, I'm watching these things, even at the colleges and stuff, how brutal they could be during that time.
Yeah.
Obviously they knew how bad that was going to get. And Martin Luther King kind of always had to worry about that.
Yeah.
He had a safe house and everything because the Ku Klux Klan was always after him.
The FBI was after him.
Yeah. J. Edgar Hoover was definitely not a fan.
No, but it got a lot worse for him. Once he decided the war was immoral and he didn't support it, that was another thing. That was another thing that killed Johnson, right? Again, Vietnam killed Johnson in that regard, because part of the reason he won in a landslide, I mean, he had the leadership of that community behind him, and now he didn't, and it just, you're right, the FBI stepped up and we'll put a lot more pressure on him at that point. But I always kind of admired him in that sense, because he always knew he was going to take a bullet at some point.
He said it in the speech the night before, right?
Yeah, I believe he
the
did.
evening prior is where he says, right, I've seen the promised land. I might not get there with you, right, but you will get there. Like that was the night.
Yeah, the
before.
mountaintop speech.
It's crazy. Yeah. Sorry, Mr. Beat, I cut you off. What are you gonna say? But
I was going to say that relationship between Martin Luther King Jr. and Lyndon Johnson was never really that solid, I would say. But I mean, they definitely at least were on the same page, throughout 1964, 1965. And so there was that bridge there between Johnson and the African American community in particular. But, when Johnson first took over as president after the untimely death of John F. Kennedy, he almost immediately said, hey, this is going to be my priority. I want to declare a war on poverty. It's the first time we started declaring war on nouns.
Yeah.
Later, the war on drugs and war on
And
terrorism.
now the war on
Yeah.
pronouns.
Yeah. War on woke. But yeah, like by 1968, the war on poverty was like it seemed like, poor people were still losing that war. Like there was no progress, and especially now that Vietnam was like that was getting all the attention by the Johnson administration. And so that's another reason why I think Dr. King was like, hey, it appears that the president has abandoned his war on poverty, his whole domestic agenda. He's abandoned us. And if you look at what those speeches of Dr. King in early 1968, he was actually like he had really broadened his purpose as to like the whole reason why after his death there was the Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah.
There was all these protests in DC that carried on his legacy. His emphasis was like, hey, we need to end poverty now. I mean, he was calling for things like universal basic income at the time, like saying, hey, systemic racism this is something that actually just doesn't, it's intersectional. It doesn't just affect African Americans, all minorities, and including white people too. All right. So it was a pretty inclusive movement. And that's another reason why I think, it was even more tragic that just as he was trying to get this going, he gets assassinated.
Well, you bring up a really good point, though, especially in that time period when you talk about economic issues, right? When you talk about the plight of the poor, you're really coming very, very close to sounding like a communist, right? At that time period, right? Essentially, you're talking about wealth, redistribution. And that's where, if you look at the numbers, in 1966, the favorable rating, right? A total favorable rating that, they poll people. Gallup did a poll and they asked people about their favorability rating of Dr. King. 1966, his favorability rating was 33%. 33% of Americans had a favorable view of him. 63% had an unfavorable view of him. Yeah. That's insane. But you can also look at that as, he took a turn on Vietnam, and he began to kind of speak in a way that a lot of Americans, right, could, especially at that time period, view as communist talk, which is insane. But, it's such an easy way to frame that at that time, especially the FBI, right? Especially J. Edgar Hoover going to try to push that propaganda as well. But it's nuts to think that, he had a Martin Luther King there was a time where 63% of Americans were like, nope, he's a bad guy. Like, that's nuts. But, that's the mid to late 60s, right? And I got a quote here too. Even after he was in the immediate aftermath of his death, there was a negative view of King as well. Nearly 1/3, 31% of people in 1968 said he brought the assassination upon himself. That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, that is wild. I mean,
that's wild. Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, so let me rephrase that though. I apologize. It depends on who, right? Gallup was also asking too, right? So 1966, he had an 83% favorability rating with African Americans, right? So the low favorability rating is obviously coming from a lot of white folks being polled, right? So, but you go back to polling techniques, who's got, where are they being, where are the questions being asked and who's being asked? But yeah, like it's crazy. May 1965, he had an 89% favorability with African Americans, 38 with white. And then in 66, it drops 83 with African Americans and 27 with white folks. So it's, even stranger, you go up to 2011, 100% favorability, African American community, 93% with white. There are still 7% of white folks in 2011. I shouldn't be laughing, but it's astounding that in 2011 there was still 7% of the white population that were like, nope, he was a bad guy.
What was it in the 80s, I wonder, when Reagan signed that law to make his birthday a federal holiday? Right. I wonder if that was a tipping point. I don't know.
Yeah, well, there was a somewhat higher, but there were states like what was it, Arizona? Arizona didn't actually pushed it as a didn't sign it as a state recognized holiday until like the 90s. So there were states that fought back. It's like insane to think about, but
Yeah,
there are still states that have National Confederate Day. So, you
true.
know, um,
Yeah. I was shocked at some of the states when they adopted national confederacy. Like
mm,
there were states in, the 1920s and 30s, and then in like the city, you could tell when civil rights is flaring up because you
sure.
could see, I want to say Texas did it really late, and I was like, what? Like you had nothing to do with all this stuff. So you could tell during that time. But his death, Martin Luther King's death, does push the Civil Rights Act of 1968. So there's
Sure.
another landmark legislation. I believe that's the Fair Housing Act.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that one deals a lot with housing, Native Americans too,
Right. It wasn't.
women, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot that are pushed in there for sure. Yeah.
Um,
Which, goes right into the Poor People's Campaign, like Mr. Beat was talking about before.
yeah, and I mean that was something that was languishing, I believe, in Congress for a long time, or at least a few years. Like they thought
Sure.
they'd done enough and they didn't want to do anymore, and it was just
Mhm.
sitting there. But that pushed it over the edge. I want to move though, since we're talking about this and the assassination, obviously you had a lot of rioting after that too, but
Sure.
Mhm.
you know, it's moving ahead a bit, but the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy,
Sure.
because in
Which,
some weird
well,
way, he picks up the mantle for poor people.
sure. And if you've ever listened, right, Bobby Kennedy was giving a speech in Indiana that night when he gets news. And if you've ever listened, you ever heard the recording?
Yeah,
No, I haven't.
So he's at I don't know, like I hate to use the word, but like a rally, right? He's talking to people in Indiana when he gets news of Dr. King's assassination, and he announces it to the crowd, and you hear the gasps,
yeah.
the audible gasps of the crowd, and they're crying. Like you hear people break. And it's if you ever get a chance, you could YouTube it, or I'm sure you find it on YouTube. Bobby Kennedy and MLK assassination. It's just such a crazy moment in time to know.
Yeah.
Obviously, hindsight's 2020, right?
He gives
Just to
such
know
a
about
great emotional speech
he did
too, with
off the cuff,
off the cuff. That's
obviously.
Wow.
amazing.
How have I not heard this yet? This is
Yeah.
Oh, it's
wow.
just it's crazy because just thinking about what it's June, right? June 68, right? He
Uh,
go Bobby
I
Kennedy,
believe
Uh,
it is
or
June
July.
or
Yeah, it is
July.
June.
right? So what? 2
Jeez.
months later, it's
You're right.
crazy to
Holy crap, exactly 2 months later after MLK.
Yeah.
yeah,
June
like
4th.
it's crazy to think, and like they have that moment where he gets news, he finds out, and excuse me, then delivers that news to a crowd, it's you just the audible gasp, you hear the emotion of the crowd.
Well,
But
you hear it in the mic. He says, "Do they know?
yeah,
Like, do they know?" He's talking to this guy. He goes, "They haven't been told." And he's like, I have to tell you, this news." But he does do such a great job in that moment. I mean,
sure,
I saw it the first time a few years ago. There was a show on Netflix called, I think it was just Bobby Kennedy for President or something like that. They did like a 4-part series on it, which was really good. But that's where I saw the speech, and I saw a lot of stuff with Martin Luther King. It's crazy because there's something in there. I think he's with, where was that? I didn't Senator Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy helped like broker a peace when they were in a church in one of the state. I can't remember where it was. It must have been in his state, but or somewhere. But Bobby Kennedy actually, like, the cops were outside. Like there was going to be a huge, huge deal. I can't remember it off the top of my head.
yeah,
But I do remember that there's like a loud applause, and I don't know if somebody dropped something or what it was. You could see Martin Luther King thinking it was like a bullet. Like he just always lived that way.
Mm.
sure,
Like he
Wow.
knew it was coming at some point. He just,
Mhm.
which is unbelievable that he could just keep doing what he was doing. So,
yeah,
but so The assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, which is like, think about that. You're
Well, let's
alive
go
during that
back.
time.
Let's go back. His brother, John F.
Exactly.
Kennedy, is assassinated 5 years prior.
That's-
Robert F. Kennedy
yep.
and John F. Kennedy are pretty close. I mean, Robert, or AKA Bobby, was in
Yeah.
the John's administration as Attorney General, right? I'm doing this all by memory right now. Okay, yeah.
Yep,
So
yeah.
and so, like, to many people, after Lyndon Johnson announces the end of March of 1968, hey, I'm not going to run for re-election. I mean, he's one of the first people immediately, like, people are thinking, okay, here's our guy. The other main guy is Eugene McCarthy. Both of them are anti-war candidates. Both of them say we need to bring our troops home from Vietnam as quickly as we can. And so younger people are all about both of these candidates. But I think Bobby has a unique appeal just because of that, being a Kennedy, being extremely charismatic, somebody who, like, definitely went out of his way to reach as many different types of people who were neglected before. Like, I Googled when you guys when you mentioned that speech that he would give after hearing about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And I had no idea about this, that he was actually in an African American neighborhood in Indianapolis.
Yes.
And that there were riots in pretty much 100 cities, but Indianapolis was not one of those cities because of Kennedy's just really passionate speech that really struck a chord, I guess, with these folks. Yeah. So, like, a lot of historians say he was even more appealing than his brother. Like, he would have done even more for civil rights, for economic injustice.
Sure.
I mean, it was like, it's hard I think that's part of the reason why here in the year of our Lord 2024, his son, Bobby Kennedy Jr., is polling at 5%, and could get 5% of the vote because he's purely, like, it's all of that, momentum of his father. People remember still to this day, Bobby Kennedy.
Which is just such when you talk about, excuse me, the parallels of 1968, Johnson not running, Biden not running, Bobby Kennedy is, like it's, it's,
you're stealing a part of my monologue, actually. I was going to do the parallels. I was going to do that.
But it's crazy to think about that, right? I mean, essentially the Democratic nominee will be decided at the convention, right? Formally. But it's crazy how many, parallels there are. It's insane. It's definitely nuts. I mean, Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s, been out there, but he's polling high. He's absolutely is. But, it's crazy to think about, the allure, right? Not to go into a crazy, take a left turn, but, the allure of the Kennedys is just such an amazing thing. It's just such an interesting concept, right? Not even a full term for JFK, was never elected with RFK, but it's just but how highly regarded in American politics these guys were, but really, I always remember my mom saying he was the best president ever. I'm like, well, he served like 2 years. Like, how do we, that's, I don't know, Ma, but she lived, she was young at the time, but it's just such an interesting story, the Kennedys. About that. But, I mean, like Mr. B was saying, though, Bobby Kennedy definitely pushed JFK towards civil rights, 100%. JFK was not really too keen to it, but Bobby Kennedy was like, look, man, you need to get on board with this, and so, he certainly was, more people saw him as more genuine towards the civil rights movement,
He did come off more genuine. He had a good sense of humor too, like a good dry sense of humor when he was running back then. Like, he was pretty funny. He got into the game late, and that was, again, Lyndon Johnson's nightmare. He didn't want Kennedy. They hated each other,
right?
From years before. They couldn't get along.
There was past there for sure.
There was
definitely history there.
But Eugene McCarthy, the young flocked to him, but he didn't have a lot of passion. He was really just the one he had one policy matter, and but that was an important one, was ending the war in Vietnam.
And he wiped the floor with LBJ in New Hampshire in the first primary. He absolutely destroyed him. And what was it, like 2 weeks after that, Johnson drops out because he saw the writing on the wall. Sure.
But then they still had the big Democrat, the big machine, you know, in Chicago and stuff. You know, Hubert Humphrey was going to be the guy. That was the guy.
Another guy from Minnesota.
Yeah.
Both Humphrey and McCarthy were from Minnesota.
Yeah.
But I do.
But they went with the Warhawk, you know, kept the same policies essentially as Johnson did.
Well, that's what made Nixon so. Nixon was fantastic running that year. I mean, he kind of shed this. He had this loser label because, you know, nobody was
1960.
He wasn't going to be around to kick around anymore. Which he was a guy who got it by then. Like I saw that people thought Nixon was, you know, like a down to earth guy. He made that statement, the silent middle, and then it became the silent majority.
Silent majority, yeah.
But he used to put on these, like, instead of doing the debates, he would go around the country and he'd have basically the first town hall, like he'd have on televised. You'd have people asking him questions and he could talk to them. And they were like, wow, he's so down to earth and he's talking to us. And they were all staged. Everything. All of it was staged. The people they put in there were staged and asked the questions that he knew what questions were coming. And, you know, he was great back then, but he was able to pound, you know, some of the things. Like I'm watching and he's saying things like, oh, I think he wasn't as, like, you know, it's so mean now. And I'm not saying it was never mean back then, but he was like, I think, you know, the Johnson administration's trying, but we need a different leadership to break through in Vietnam. Meanwhile, he never talked about how he was going to end the war in Vietnam, and he never did end the war in Vietnam.
No.
But you know, in fact, he bombed the hell out of Vietnam too, and Cambodia and stuff. But
sure, yeah, illegal bombing and
illegal, yeah. So
yep.
But Kennedy's a weird one, and I don't know if it's a romanticized thing, but it does feel like he got in really late and he won in California the night he was killed. I know he turned when he got the news that he won, and he says, I'm finally like out of the shadow. He felt like he did it himself. Like he was out of the shadow of his brother.
Yeah.
And then
Saran,
Saran
who is still alive. And
yes, he is.
To this day. Yeah. And to this day, still in prison, of course, but to this day does not remember doing it. He still says that every time he talks to the media.
It's the conspiracy theory that he was a sleeper cell agent.
Yeah.
That what do they call it? What's the name of it?
Was it
COINTELPRO? Manchurian Candidate.
Oh yeah. Take over the brain.
Yeah.
No evidence of that, but we do know there's lots of shady stuff that the CIA was doing at the time.
Definitely did.
Yeah, so it's not out of the realm of possibility for sure.
No, well, I mean, they were, look, not to get into crazy stuff, but I mean, MK Ultra was thriving at that time. You're right. I mean, who's to say? I mean, I'm not, putting my eggs in that basket per se, but yeah, the CIA was doing some insane stuff specifically targeted towards mind control.
They bought all the LSD in the world. Every ounce of it. They literally cornered the market. They bought it all. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. So, yeah.
That's why conspiracy theories get a lot of push, because there is always a kernel of truth in there somewhere, usually.
There's something in there to be like, I don't know.
You look at a lot of stuff, a lot of the medical breakthroughs, when you see what happened, you're like, that's how they did that, I
always say, it's comparable. I'm not very religious myself, so but I was raised that way, and so I always say, hey, you don't need to come up with crazy stories. All you have to do is learn about black holes, and it's the same thing with history. If the natural world is far more interesting than the supernatural world, the stuff that really did happen is insane. I mean, the CIA alone. I mean, there's a channel called Necessary Information if you want to check it on YouTube. Most of his videos. He dedicates time to the crazy stuff the CIA was just trying to do with the.
Look at Iran in what 1953. That was insane, right? The coup d'état 53 was crazy.
Well, you look
Like-
at what we did in the Middle East a lot. You'd be like,
my
or in
Lord,
South
man.
America, even.
Oh my God, yeah,
From,
Grenada,
like,
all that stuff. I mean, it's
even from the early days in the 20s and so the one you did on the now we're getting off. It's okay. On the the fascist plot
that's
for
the
America,
1933,
which
Wall
is a
Street
real
coup.
thing that
Oh,
nobody
yeah.
knows about. Like
Nuts.
nobody ever talks about that.
Dude,
That-
Teddy Roosevelt started a revolution in South America for the Panama Canal. He
Yeah.
literally created a country out of a revolution so we could have access to
Taught
the
the
Pacific Ocean.
Panamanians to break away from Colombia. That's right.
Yes, like
Yep.
that's crazy.
Well, even like Mexico, like you get into that in the early 1900s and or like
Sure.
1950. I mean, we switched sides on the war over there. There's civil war so many times, and we fund different people. It's so crazy.
Yes,
you
Iran
know.
Contra. Like it the list just goes on.
But like,
But I
yeah,
do like
Iran
ghosts.
Contra.
I like the supernatural, so I will say that though. I've been on lots of ghost hunts.
You doing any this summer?
None this summer. This summer's been crazy, but I'll tell you, man, I'm definitely gonna go up there and do some ghost hunts in Hamilton. Super Revolutionary War area up
Yeah.
in Jersey. And when I do, you're coming with me, man. So-
I will be there. I
All right,
will
good.
definitely. Remember, we got the invite from the lady when you're on my show
In Tennessee, yeah.
Yeah.
We gotta go
So-
to that.
So I have no clue how we did that, how we got to Ghost, but
That was my
it's
my
probably a
fault.
good. It's probably a good
I was
spot.
piggybacking off of Mr. Beat.
Oh, that makes sense. So yeah, we're talking about the assassinations.
Saran, that's what started. it.
Yes.
Saran. He
So,
never
yes.
did. He never give any indication about why he did it. He says he doesn't even remember doing it
There's minimal
because I couldn't find anything.
evidence like to this day, there's not much uncovered as far as why he did it. He did have a short statement explaining why. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's like
The tragedy happened, and then just to kind of keep you moving along to August, you have Eugene McCarthy, who's still around, who still has a lot of supporters, but nope. The Democratic Party is just going to be like giving the middle finger to him and his supporters, saying we're going to go with Hubert Humphrey anyway.
yeah,
It's kind of like Bernie Sanders in 2016 a little bit.
Yeah, with super
It's-
delegates.
it's
Yeah.
shades of that. A little
Sure.
more violent, but
Absolutely, a lot
That-
more violent for sure. Yeah.
that convention is bonkers outside.
Mayor Daley just went full, Bull. What's his face from the South? Bull. What's the name of the sheriff? Bull Connor. That's who it is.
Oh,
he
Bull
went.
Connor,
He
yeah.
went full Sheriff Bull Connor out there in
Yeah.
Chicagoland. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so the reflection outside and inside is almost the same, right? Like the
Mhm.
feel of it. That convention is nuts on the inside too. But at one point they're shooting tear gas into the crowd, and there's video of Humphrey just waiting, looking at the tally, and he's sneezing and he's starting to tear up because there's so much out there. It's starting to get
Sure.
into the
Steep
convention.
inside.
So they didn't know what was going on. Then they figured out what was going on outside. And, you see it like all the shoving going on inside the convention. The Democratic machine gets what they wanted. Lyndon Johnson had a lot of pull back then.
Sure. They handed the election to Nixon. I
Yep.
mean, Humphrey
Oh,
was
that-
behind in the polls immediately. I mean, he was,
Mhm.
Yeah, he was behind me. Well, because he just looked like, all right, so we're getting rid of the one guy. It was easy for Nixon. It's like,
Well,
well,
Johnson
it's the
for
same
Johnson,
guy
yeah.
with the same policies. What
sure.
does it
I
matter?
mean, popular vote was pretty much razor thin, but
Yes.
I mean, he steadily lost, as far as electoral votes.
He
Yeah,
was the
but
law and
just-
order candidate, and it was a year that did not have much law and order.
No. And as Lee Atwater will state later on, right, what law and order will turn out to mean,
Mhm.
for sure. But it's, we touched upon it before. when we talked about, the civil rights movement, going through Selma, right, and Montgomery and things of that nature,
Mhm.
and just the brutality of the police force, right? And you go to Chicago, right, and it's the brutality of the police force. And I think Jay, I think you had mentioned, like, were they not aware that they were on camera? I don't think it mattered. I think it was
It
just
didn't matter
business as
back then.
usual.
The
Yeah.
whole
It was
world
just
is watching.
but it was business as usual. That's how people
Well,
in the
see,
eyes were dealt with.
they see now it's similar to like with the race riots. Like people, they saw the chaos and they automatically had a bias to side with the police, even though the
Yes.
police were clearly like doing
The
horrible
aggressors.
things. Like they injured dozens of people, but like still people kind of like, okay, well, these anti-Vietnam hippies, these dang hippies deserved it,
Get a haircut. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
The
Yeah.
optics
And
of it.
absolutely. But it's kind of like, if you look at like Rodney King, right? The brutality of the Rodney King video, but the community out there, right? The black community out there was looking at it saying, that's every day. Like we
Yeah.
see that every day. And to the rest of America, it's like, oh my God. But that was every day. So like what we see happening, right, to the marchers going through Selma, that's what happened every day. Right.
Mhm.
That's you stood up. If you stood out of line, right, you got out of line, specifically on race matters. That's what happened to you, cameras or not. But the cameras, and that was the brilliance, as we said before, of the civil rights movement, of the nonviolent, particularly the nonviolent part. Do not fight back. Show the world the true monsters that they are, because everyone will be watching. And it's the same thing with the Democratic National Convention, right? Daley just unleashed his police force and said, do your thing,
Yeah.
do what you do.
And like you
And
said, handed it to Nick.
it did.
Nixon, it was so easy on so many fronts just to be like law and order. He sat there. Most Americans, this is where a lot of the media blame started too, in that from that end. He's
Sure.
like they only focus on these kids in the colleges, and that's not true America. He started his
Mhm.
Southern strategy,
Absolutely.
which changed the party dynamics for years. But who's an interesting one to mention as far as we're talking about law and order or the civil rights stuff. The saying is for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. George Wallace.
I knew you were gonna say it.
I knew it.
George
Yeah.
Wallace.
Yeah,
Dude, he
quite a
picked up
third party run that year.
he picked up 5 states.
He picked, yeah. In fact, they thought it was going to get kicked back to that. They didn't know what was going to happen. I remember seeing news reports back then, and they're talking about like, is this going to be the last year of the Electoral College? Because nobody understands really what happens now.
Yeah.
If this thing gets kicked back to the states, and it's weird when it gets kicked back to the states because it goes to the assemblies and all kinds of stuff, and it's a weird system. It's not like it just goes back to, the state gets to choose and the electors. Now it's a huge thing. So it was almost like a constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
This is the closest we ever got to getting rid of the Electoral College. It was after this election, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, they were talking about it, which I have my own opinions. They hate it, but whatever.
I know Mr. Beat feels some sort of way about the Electoral College.
Yeah. I have, yeah.
To put it mildly.
I hate it too. Yeah.
Yes.
I think
do.
I've seen the video.
But yeah, he pulled out 5 states and
13.5% of the vote.
And he got 1 electoral vote from North Carolina. Right? Nixon won North Carolina, but 1 elector went, nope, I'm going Wallace. Yeah. But that's insane to think about. This is the segregation now. Segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Right? This until is that guy.
And he served until like, I want to say 1994 or something.
That's a Democrat.
Somebody tried to assassinate him.
Yeah, we got shot too. The next, the next
and he changed his tune a little bit after that. Like all of a sudden he became.
Yeah, that's what Trump did for like a day.
Well, like Trump did for
12 hours.
I saw a tweet and I was like, "Oh, it's over."
A quarter of a speech. Yeah, no, but yeah, you're right. I mean, he was a full-fledged Democrat until what, 95 or so. I think he left the Democratic Party in 95.
Yeah.
Which is crazy to think like he stayed that long.
And you want to know something crazy? is at one point when they were doing the polling, I don't remember what month it was, he had a 21% of the vote. And he kind of started to lose it. He couldn't get anybody to run with him on the ticket. He had a lot of trouble trying to get somebody to run because they're like, it's a little too crazy for me. Do you know his campaign called Colonel Sanders of KFC fame and asked him to run with him? I swear to God. And Colonel Sanders said, "Are you nuts? I serve food to people in the South, like everywhere, because that's not good for business, the segregation stuff." So he ended up with Curtis LeMay.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
He was a character himself. Yeah.
Mr. Beat, I don't know if you saw the day they introduced him, what happened, maybe.
I'll refresh my memory. It's been a while since I looked at it.
The problem, he was a character, he was kind of nuts, but he was on the Strategic Air Command, I think from 47 till 58, which is has to do with delivering the nuclear strikes. He was huge. He was a big nuke everybody person.
Yes.
And I think at that
like a
time,
Dr. Strangelove type of George Patton.
And if you remember, like, we dropped the bomb and it was a big deal, but we didn't realize what the fallout was going to be. That's about the time we're starting to really like figure this stuff out and study it, I believe. Because we didn't know, like, that was going to affect generations. We just, whatever. So they told him when he went out, give your speech, don't talk about nuclear weapons, no matter what. Somebody brings it up, just deflect the question. First question, something about, do you still stand by your nuclear stance? And soon he goes into this thing and he's talking about, we look at these areas and the plants and the animals came back bigger.
That's right.
And he goes,
we helped them out.
He basically says that. He goes, we should start dropping them like in other places.
Everywhere.
It was so crazy. And you see Wallace's face, and Wallace walks off before it's over, and his staff, and they're trying to pull him off stage, and he's like, wait, I didn't give my speech yet. And they end it.
If George Wallace walks away like, I can't with this guy.
George Wallace had this face on like, look at this crazy bastard.
Yeah, man, that says everything you need to know.
Like, but it was one of the funniest things. So he literally dropped in polling by the time November comes around when he takes 13.5%.
But he still ends up with 9.9 million votes.
That's what I'm saying.
Well, it's important to remember with Wallace, he was really actively trying to reach a broader electorate with his populist rhetoric, because like, especially there were a lot of northern working class folks who they weren't necessarily on board with segregation, but he kind of like definitely toned down that segregation talk, and he's like, hey, like, actually, if you listen to some of his speeches during that campaign, also in 1972 as well, he kind of sounds a little bit like Trump.
I know. I didn't want to say it. Yeah.
I mean, it's not all of what Trump said, was, I think a lot of people actually agreed with some of the stuff he was saying in 2016, especially when he's like, yeah, we got to take out the elites and drain the swamp, stuff like that, like.
Bring jobs back to the United States. Yeah, those type of
anti-elitism rhetoric.
Yeah, he tapped into an anger that is palpable and is understandable, right? Like a lot of that populist stuff, I understand it. I get mad about the whole elitism sometimes, and and the
I hate it when they eat babies. Like, it's just like.
I also, like, not to sound, I'm on board for everybody together, but those lizard people bother me.
Yeah, the reptilians running the world. Oh my god!
I mean, is that racist? Not liking the reptilian people? I don't know.
So funny.
Maybe
I have a reptilian joke in my next video. It's so funny you brought that up.
Really?
Yeah.
Awesome. Very good. Very good. No, but he certainly does. I'm doing a unit on and populism this year, and I took speeches from Wallace, Huey Long, a Trump, portions of Trump's inauguration speech, the American Carnage speech, and Bernie Sanders. and to just show right how attractive populism can be. It's a very attractive, and effective method, but it's excuse me, so much of it is timing, right? So much of it is timing. So much of it is the current economic system in the earth, or the current economic state, and as you guys said before too, it's a good time to tap into that is, as you mentioned with the inflation rate in 68 is starting to go up, is certainly by 72 it's getting higher and higher. It's so the populism works, man. It
Well,
works.
it's also, like you said, the timing issue. I mean, when
Yeah, it works when the
Theodore,
timing is right,
wouldn't,
right?
wouldn't Teddy Roosevelt be a populist? Like it wasn't a bad word at one
Yeah.
time.
No, he
William
certainly
Jennings
had
Bryan
popular.
was a
Absolutely,
populist.
yeah.
Yeah.
Cross the
Yeah, I mean,
gold,
that's
all that stuff. 100%,
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's
Especially going after. I mean, you said Teddy Roosevelt going after the big businesses, right? Because they're stepping on the small guy, the little guy, 100%. Yeah, it's not a four-letter word, and certainly lots of politicians have populist tendencies for sure. I mean, Bernie Sanders has been a populist for decades, and it's worked. He's one of the few politicians, in my opinion, whose stances haven't changed. I mean,
Yeah.
since he's been the mayor of Burlington, he's had the same stances,
Yeah.
and
well, that's why there's a lot of people who don't agree with him, who wouldn't vote for him, and that they actually don't dislike him. It's kind of like Ron Paul had that kind of appeal too, right? Because he always had like the same stance.
sure.
Principled. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like a
Yeah.
principled thing. The Tea Party, the other part. It's funny because like he seems normal as far as that front, and then there's like the Tea Party movement who gets a
Well,
little,
there's his son,
and then his son's like totally,
Uh,
Well,
Is
he's Machiavellian. That's his son.
yes,
Yeah.
It's all
absolutely,
about the power. Yeah.
100%. It was the optician.
yeah. But no,
Went to war with Dr. Fauci.
that's right.
Anyway,
It's all-
sorry, way off campus here.
Yeah, but
Um,
but Wallace is one of the more intriguing people because it's so close in time. I mean, that's
but it shows you, the state of the United States politically in 1968, when you have somebody who's essentially running on the platform of segregation, right? Throwing a dash of populism as well, and it's going to a third party candidate who's going to carry 5 states. That's mind boggling, right? That's absolutely mind boggling to think about.
is
You
he
know,
the Perot? Who had the most as a third party candidate?
I believe
Who
it
got the
was.
most
I
of the
want to say it was
popular vote?
Perot,
It's got to be Perot, right? 19% or something,
something like
19.5.
that. Yeah.
Oh, in '92. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Higher numbers of population for sure, but I believe Perot. I mean, I'll
Yeah,
look
but
it
as
up.
far as the most third party electoral votes,
Yeah, third.
I,
Yeah,
I
that's
think I think well, I do know that Wallace was the last third party presidential candidate to get all of a state's electoral votes. That's for sure. Electoral votes is a whole nother thing, but as a
Mhm.
sectional,
Yeah,
it was all the South. It was all like the deep South.
yeah.
Sure.
It's all you
So-
could see it, but it's all five. It's like five in a row, right?
Whereas Perot was all over the country, spread out. That's one reason why he failed to get one state in
Another-
the electoral college.
Another dude you
Yeah.
could call a populist, right? I mean, he had a populist message, I think.
Sure.
Sure,
Perot.
yeah, definitely.
And a lot of charts. He had lots of charts.
The charts were big.
Yeah, 19% of the vote.
Okay.
More than 19 million votes.
He's
And,
another guy, though. You talk about momentum, right? Like, so Robert Kennedy would have been interesting in 68. Perot drops out for like 2 months in the
Mhm.
middle of that election.
Right when he was polling higher than ever.
Right.
Yeah.
It would have been very interesting to see how that played out. I think they did do like a study of the people who voted for him, and they said it really didn't affect the Bush-Clinton election as much as, everybody always tried to say.
Yeah, I've read
Clinton
that as
won it
well.
but it really was, he kind of split the vote with them. So that was always, that's an interesting one to me too, to see what he would have took. Like, I don't think he would have won, but
Well, it's going to be interesting this year because Bobby Kennedy Jr. is on 42 states. I want to say he's going to be ballots on 42 states.
Yeah.
So that's going to be
Impressive for somebody who's not with a political party.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. You know, say what you want, think what you want, but that's impressive to get. It's because it's not easy to get on the ballots of a state. You know, the two parties make it that way. It's not. It's purposely,
Yeah,
a
well,
very
it
difficult
is.
thing for third parties to actually get into the race.
They
for
have
sure.
it very, yeah. If you ever look at the rules, the way they're set up,
Oh yeah,
I mean,
financially, everything.
it's impossible. A lot of those guys, well, going back to Ron Paul, he said it because they asked him once about going independent or going libertarian. And he's like, it's impossible. It's impossible to get
He
on.
did.
Well,
In '88, he went and
Well, I
that's
think they were asking.
libertarian, but that's why he never did it again.
Yeah, I think he was. They were asking him. I think in 2008 when he had a little.
that's why
surge.
Sanders became a Democrat in 2016. He knew that there's no way he could do it independent, and it's a lot of
Exactly.
the Democrats were angry. Who's not a real Democrat? Well, I mean, what do you expect the guy to do? I mean,
I mean, yeah, the rules are
he
set up.
caucuses with you guys, so yeah, he's technically a Democrat, technically, but
He's going to vote 99% with you.
Yeah.
So, what are you complaining about? So, yeah, but I mean, continuing on that, Nixon, the Republican convention is very interesting because I always say 1968 is the end of like the FDR coalition. That's the end of that era, and I think that's the beginning. I know Ronald Reagan doesn't get in until 1980, but it's like sowing the seeds for Reagan because Reagan does challenge at that convention.
Yeah.
And makes a name for himself. I think he does this time of, is that where he does the time of, no, it's 64. He did the time of our choosing speech, right? That's where he kind of got a name for himself. I'm trying to think of where that speech was. But
not 100% sure on that one.
Yeah. But he makes an impact. But what gets lost in that is Nelson Rockefeller ran against Nixon. And he was a liberal Republican. And he got ousted pretty hard. And you could see it there. That's where like a huge sea change is, and where there's a push to this more of the conservative brand that we have now.
Sure.
At least towards the 80s, right? Like there's only white faces there. There's not a real there's no diversity there. It looks like an older party.
I mean, you look at half the people that surrounded George W. Bush. They were all on the Nixon administration. They were Rumsfeld and all those guys. I mean, it was like getting the band back together again. So yeah, absolutely. This is absolutely. I mean, I agree with you. It's laying the foundation of the conservative party that will come in the next couple of decades.
But still, it's important to say Nixon was also, I would say, kind of liberal, somewhat tied with the New Deal coalition because he still was a big government guy. He still was for big government programs, continued many of the same programs that liberal Republicans
creates.
Wanted,
yeah, he creates
Democrats.
The EPA. Right?
Yeah,
he created the EPA. He created a couple of other ones, but he says he's Keynesian at one point, which blew everybody's mind.
He was.
Keynesian,
He's incredibly popular. I mean, look at you ever see the Electoral College map in 1972? It's insane. I mean, he lost Massachusetts. That was it.
Well,
he wiped.
But that's why the Watergate's so dumb.
It was so crazy.
You know what I mean?
He didn't need to do
it. What did it matter? Like he just had to have that. Like why
it was that insecurity, like
paranoia.
That paranoia and insecurity. Totally, it was his Vietnam. But I mean, if you look at an Electoral College map of 72, it's all red. It's insane to look at. I mean, the numbers are nuts. McGovern, let's look at it. 520 electoral votes to 17. My God. Talk about a landslide.
I mean, it's like
the widest
referendum, right?
Widest margin of any presidential election in American history was 1972.
Yeah, I mean, he just shellacked him, But it goes to show from obviously 68 to 72, most Americans thought he did a pretty good job.
But also on the flip side, the Democratic Party now had completely shrank because everybody who was with it before that was in the South was like, no, I'm not doing it anymore.
Well, good point.
And I'm going to give Nixon a shot because maybe he'll be better with being racist. And well, the war on drugs is pretty racist. He started that.
Yeah, well, I mean,
So,
like we mentioned before, it goes into Lee Atwater territory, right? Now they're
yeah, they
really using.
actively, this is the first time the Republican Party actively pursued Southern voters. Was
Yes.
after 1972 election was the first time they did that. Yeah.
Yeah, the Southern strategy.
Southern
You're
strategy.
completely, using dog whistle politics. I mean, if you're out there and you're not really sure what we're talking about, if you look up or you go to YouTube and you look up Lee Atwater Southern Strategy, you'll hear it. There's a recording of Lee Atwater. You'll know it's insane. It's crazy. Of using dog whistle politics. It's a pretty. We can't repeat the words here, nor should they ever be repeated. But it's an insane recording. It's absolutely nuts.
Yeah, and a lot of those dog whistle tactics are still around,
Still,
right? I mean,
law and order. Yeah, they're still being used today. But
yeah, yeah, but I mean, I always, like I said, and I agree with you, Mr. B. I always say if he was around today, he would definitely be a rhino to a
Yep.
liberal. I mean, I try to so I get some pushback sometimes from people because there's a lot of people who will say things like I'm getting pushed right or left or whatever. Say, politically, I'm not saying this is in a good or bad sense, but we have obviously taken, I would say, a right turn at least since the 80s. And then, I look at a guy like Clinton and I would always ask, if you think we're getting pushed left, would you think Clinton is closer to Richard Nixon or LBJ? I mean, Clinton's much closer to Nixon.
Nixon by far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's important to say, we've been a right-leaning country since Reagan, economically,
Right.
which is pretty freaking important. but
Yeah.
yeah, obviously socially, we've become more to the left in recent decades. But yeah, economically, that's why it's so crazy to see the direction that both parties are going in the last 8 years. That's why we're in probably a new party system, is because of those economic policies shifting. Sure. I say in both parties.
Yeah. Especially, I think as you see younger people getting out to vote, it's going to change a lot of things.
Going back to what the Kerner Commission said too, right? So much of the economic policies they blamed as a catalyst for so many of those race riots too. So your economic policies absolutely have an effect socially as well.
Always. Yeah.
So it's not surprising to think that if we've gone more right economically, right, socially, we seem to have been pushing against that and gone back almost the other way, specifically in the last couple of decades.
Yeah. But I guess Mr. Beat's right. I mean, we have gay marriage and stuff. So that's something I didn't know would even happen in our lifetime. Marijuana and gay marriage.
Sure.
I mean, that moved so fast, a lot of that stuff. I remember when Bush was in office, I mean, it was still like, I think he was trying to get everybody's mind off of what was going on. Speaking of another his Vietnam in Iraq,
sure.
By we're going to push an amendment which was ridiculous. Nobody was going to do that. For marriage is between a man and a woman. And then Obama's in office and, we have rights for marriage for gay people.
Yeah, Obergefell, drops in.
But that's such a stark turnaround.
Sure, the public backing of it changed pretty dramatically over a good 15-year span. I mean, you look at, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the public, not much of it. It's still pretty evenly split. It wasn't
no, and I always thought the
favor.
90s were kind of open, but compared to like,
it was a good start.
Yeah, well, it started, but it was more like, when I think about it in my youth, a lot of people are like, I don't mind gay people, I just don't want to bid on me, or so, something stupid. Like, all right, dude, like, you're not that great. Like,
they have taste, sir.
Yeah, there's still taste involved.
Yeah, they still have taste.
All this stuff. But yeah, I mean, it just the needle moves. But same thing, marijuana. it moved really fast to me. I think you'll see, LSD at some point, or mushrooms and stuff like that
Psilocybin,
soon.
yeah, you
Yeah,
mentioned.
you'll
Yeah,
see all that
psilocybin,
stuff
sure.
soon. I think
Well,
we're getting a little more open with that. And then I don't know, abortion's like the big one, obviously, because that went back.
but look at how everybody's
But
voting.
the reaction to it is going to be
Yeah.
interesting. I think that's where you're going to see a lot of the kids come out too.
Sure.
I think that's a big.
I mean, look how, Mr. Beat, your own backyard, Kansas, man, that was that vote was crazy,
Yeah.
that was, like that was a wake up call, I think, for the GOP. That was, I didn't see that one coming. That was,
Some going to break there because the GOP is going to have to acknowledge this, but they're obviously they're afraid of losing that coalition of Christian voters. Is what's holding that back.
they're starting to backtrack in North Carolina right now. We've got a guy named Mark Robinson running for governor who,
Oh, that guy.
oh my Lord.
Uh,
Oh my Lord. But well, he's got a new ad coming out that he and his wife, and he goes on the ad, he tells it he and his wife had an abortion 20
oh,
years ago.
really?
And yeah, so he comes in and he gets all teary-eyed. And it's interesting how he tells his wife's story, but that's a whole nother thing. His wife doesn't say a word. But yeah, he tells a story, and so he's now backtracking, saying essentially, look, we've got a very good 15-week policy in North Carolina, and I'm going to keep that. I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to go any. We need to protect women. We got to protect women's rights. So you can see he's backtracking now. But we still need to stop late term abortion, which doesn't
which doesn't
happen.
happen.
It's not a medical term, actually. It's
Or didn't Trump say after birth abortion?
Yeah.
Didn't he say something like after birth abortion?
Also known as murder.
Murder.
Yeah.
Murder, yeah. So
Murder
it's not
is
even
wrong.
That can
Okay.
happen at any time, by the way.
Yeah.
You could be 47 and you're late term aborted. That means you're murdered. So
Who said it the other day? Oh my Lord. There was, oh man, I don't remember who it was.
well, when I
But
was looking at the stuff for Project 2025 when we were doing it, I mean, they were asking what is it, Kevin this guy who runs the Heritage,
Kevin Richards.
Richards. I want to say
Yeah.
Roberts. Richards. They started asking him questions and he was deflecting by saying, like, do you think it's right that Democrats want late term and after birth abort? Like, what? What are you
Yeah.
talking about? They were like, that doesn't happen in real life.
They
But
have to create straw men.
I
Yeah.
apologize, Jay. I apologize. It is Kevin Roberts. I apologize.
oh, it is Kevin Roberts.
Yes, my fault, sir.
Wow.
My fault.
I
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
trust myself on that. So after reviewing some of this, what do you think? Well, I was going to ask the lasting legacy, but I think almost we know what we kind of are covering the legacy of it is. What parallel? I want to say parallels. Do you think we're just as divided or as divisive as we were then? And I can't think that we're as violent. I know we've had an assassination attempt and we've had, obviously, I mean, that's going back 4 years, but the Capitol riot and stuff. And in 1 year, what happens there? That's enough for a lifetime.
I don't know. I don't know if I can answer that because being alive today and being aware of the political sphere and the way you know what I mean. I wasn't alive, obviously in 68. So I don't know. You can feel it in the air right now. It's a different feeling, right? But I will tell you, I believe that this year, this election, is as pivotal as ever, right? So it may be just as important as 68. 68 may have some different ramifications, I believe. But I think, if you look back at important years in modern American history, I think this will rank right up there with 68. Again, I can't say like if the divisiveness, I don't know. I mean, there was quite a bit of divisiveness back then for sure. I don't know if everything is amplified because of social media, things like that, and particular things, tools that we have at our disposal. But again, I couldn't say with certainty because I wasn't back then. But I will say I'd be willing to say that 2024 I believe will be a year that will be as pivotal and maybe as important as 1968 was. I mean, 68 was just, and we've only gone over a few of the events. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I always loved
there's
the
a lot
68
more.
Olympics, man, in Mexico City with, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, man. Oh my God, that's just such an amazing. But, my point is that, yeah, I think there was so much that happened then. And even if you couple in the last few years, even going back to 21, if you just couple this all into an election cycle, this is such a crazy, important pivotal time, in modern American history. Yeah, that's my take on it.
Mr. B.
Yeah, I do think that because of the economic situation today, it's a little bit different because today it seems we have much more desperation, not just the United States, but around the world. So a shrinking middle class has made it, I think, more difficult, compounded by just the inflation that we have seen the past 2 years. Even though it's slowing down now, it's the worst inflation the United States has seen, most of the world has ever seen since the 1970s, going back all the way, or no, early 1980s, I should say. And so that has really made it so that, maybe we should go back to Donald Trump for another 4 years. And to understand like why somebody would consider that, most of the folks who are thinking back on the first term of Donald Trump, they're nostalgic for how things were. Like my life was pretty good for 2017 through 2019, so I get it. But those folks generally just, they're not into politics. They don't follow things closely enough. Whereas there are people that follow politics closely like us that were like, oh, yeah, if Project 2025 actually is an influence on a second Trump term, this could take us on a path towards authoritarianism in some ways. And so, yeah, that's troubling. And that's why I get you say this is a very pivotal election. We shall see. But comparing it to 1968, I always hate to compare, to make too many comparisons because, the Vietnam War was kind of like I said earlier, it was the big issue. Everything else was kind of way in the background. And also, I think Nixon was kind of right when he said there was this, quote, silent majority.
Yeah.
When most Americans did agree on most issues. They're really like the loudest two groups, I think, in 1968 were the anti-war protesters and then the segregationists who were still resisting the civil rights movement led by Wallace. Other than that, though, I think most Americans were on the same page. They were still part of the New Deal coalition. That they were still on board with that. Whereas today, it's like there's so many different groups. It's like, are there even two sides? There's really 30 sides,
Yeah.
There's
I think there's
smaller coalitions on each side.
I will wrap this up by saying I do see, especially the last couple of weeks, a strong coalition of people against specifically Donald Trump.
I do.
And I think that's the thing, so-called. Yeah, there's this. I think a lot of people are coming together now that normally would not come together just to unite against him. So that's probably another difference.
I agree.
Yeah.
You guys think Wallace could get votes today? I feel like he could.
I feel
like he could. I feel like he
be.
could pull some major numbers. I hate to say
Well,
it.
because Mr. Beat is right in a sense. He deflected a lot of that stuff in 68 when they talked to him. He's like, I don't want to talk. They would ask him, do you think your daughter should marry a black man or something? He's like, I don't want to talk about that. Say later, he goes I don't think they should. It should happen, but that's not what this is about.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
And his segregation comments were what, 63, right? With inauguration of 63, 64ish, right? Going into the governorship. So it's, not huge time, but it wasn't like the year before, right? It wasn't, and it certainly wasn't on the campaign trail either.
But that is an appropriate time. I don't want to say it's ever appropriate to say that, but his timing saying that in 63 makes sense because you got the Civil Rights Act about to get through and gaining momentum, and there's always just that push against that against that stuff, so
And he only cared at the time about the people of Alabama versus the entire country.
Absolutely.
True.
100%. Yeah.
True. Yeah, I guess you're right, the two of you. Times are always, it's hard to compare times. You could see little echoes of things. It's also weird too, because I look back and it's like, we know how that stuff turned out, but when they were living through 68, who the hell knew what was going to happen? I mean, every day you must have turned on the TV and just,
It had to be so turbulent. Like, it had to be so crazy.
yeah, you must have been like the experiment's over. Like, this is
Mm-hmm.
this is coming to an end, which you hear now,
Sure.
a lot of. And, my lifetime since I got into history or politics or whatever, I mean, I got really into the politics when the war on terror was happening and stuff, but like every day it was battered into us like this could be the end of everything, democracy and stuff like that. So, like we've just been living with that forever. But I could see in 1968 really thinking that this thing is it's gonna come apart. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's definitely different. Everybody's different. I think Danny, you're right. Probably social media is a huge factor now.
Yeah.
Maybe that's comparative to the way media affected everything in 68 because it was new back then too. So
Yeah.
time will tell. But listen, you guys, thank you so much for this. I was looking forward to this all day. There's so much we probably still could have hit on, but I think everybody gets the point. And like I said, thank you guys again for coming on. You guys can plug yourself. Whoever wants to go first.
Mr. Beat, go ahead, sir.
Okay. Yeah, my channel is Mr. Beat. If you just search anywhere, and Mr. Beast will pop up probably, but it's just you can drop the S because I never miss a beat. So yeah, it's just Mr. Beat. And I guess because of what our topic for this episode, 1968, I have a book that I wrote about and a series that they go together about every single presidential election in American history, and that's kind of one of my the big series I have on my channel. So
I'm going to cut in for a second because I want to tell you, in my house, I've been watching you for like 10 or 12 years. Dave told Smith when he was having you on, I was like, I watch Mr. Beat all the time.
wow.
So when I mentioned like you're going to be on a show, my 9-year-old's like, you got Mr. Beast to come on your show?
Of course,
and
of course.
I was like, no.
Even better.
Like, what? Yeah. So,
well, Mr. Beast, tell her, Mr. or him, or them, Mr. Beast is canceled. Apparently, have you been following?
Oh yeah,
Yes, I
heard something
have.
about that.
Yes, it's a big issue going on over
A lot
there.
of the kids don't know that he's canceled. So
Yeah,
you gotta let them know.
Well, maybe he'll want to do my show then.
I haven't got
There
the
you go.
cancellation notice yet.
All right, Danny, I think people know where to find you.
Yeah,
at
I
this
mean, if you've
point,
listened
but-
to Jay's show consistently, I've been on quite a few times. He's been on mine quite a few times. From the Story Of podcast, where you can find anywhere each week. My co-host and I, we take a historical topic, we research it independently. We don't share any information with each other. We take everything that we've learned and we go back to the table. We throw it all on the table. We compare notes and we put it all together to tell you the story of. So anything from history to paranormal to conspiracy theories to just weird jobs and sports, you name it. We talk about it all. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, come on, check us out. The Story Of. We'd love to have some new listeners. That'd be good. New season 4 is going to start this fall. So
Nice.
we're excited.
Nice. I'm gonna
And
jump
both of these
on.
gentlemen, I'm hoping to have back on. Jay, I know you. You'll come on. Mr. Beat, you're always welcome on. You've come on a couple times, so we'd love to have you back as well.
I now always I can crash. I crash it at some points. I have crashed one episode.
You have crashed. That's fair. You showed up. We were like, "Is that Jay? Where? What?" You and Joe came on. That was funny.
Me and Joe were doing an episode, which I feel bad. I have to put together, but yeah, we ended up. I forget. We were talking, and he's like, "Oh yeah, they're recording right now." We're like, "It's crashing." When it comes out,
popped in the room.
well, when it comes out, you'll hear it at the end. Like we just start talking about it. Like, you want to crash it? I'm like, all right, bye everybody. Like we're gonna go crash the show.
I think I published the episode already where you guys crashed it. We were like,
Yeah.
"Oh." So yeah, we gotta make sure. Anyways, yeah, season 4 coming out. It'll be a lot of fun. I looking forward to it. I was gonna do an episode of 1968.
You still should. There's so much you can talk about. It would actually be really interesting to hear what the guys come up with, honestly. Like, that's what's cool about your show. It's like everybody just finds their own interpretation of things.
Sure. Yeah, it's fun.
All right. Well, again, thank you guys so much. I'm sure we'll talk again.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for taking some time out of your day today and listening to the show. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to learn more about the topics discussed in this episode, check out our show notes at my website, jburkshow.podbean.com. And don't forget to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Good Pods, or wherever you enjoy your favorite podcast so you never miss out. You can also follow us at JBurk Show on Twitter and Instagram, and JBurk17 on TikTok for the latest updates and going-ons behind the scenes. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review. It helps us improve and grow the show, and each and every one of you has such an impact on that, and I can't thank you enough. Join us next time, and remember,
it won't always be a straight line, but take the journey and escape a while for thoughtful excursions into the world of ideas across media, politics, technology, pop culture, and all realms of civic life.
You're listening to the With Jay Burke Show.